Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Hat Historian. In this video, I will be talking about a very useful and popular military hat in the field, the Boonie hat. The Boonie hat is a type of sun hat with a wide brim worn by some militaries in hot or sunny climates when a helmet is not required. Made of canvas and usually consisting of a soft cylindrical crown with a brim stiffened by rows of stitching, it can have various attributes to make it more useful to the wearer, such as buttons to allow the brim to be folded up, loops along the hatband to allow camouflage foliage or minor equipment to be stored, and a chin strap to keep it on in windy conditions. Worn in slightly differing forms by several armed forces throughout the world, it is a popular option for soldiers to protect themselves from harsh climates they can be deployed to. So let us see where it comes from. Protecting soldiers from the sun has been a concern for armies operating in hot climates for centuries. People from such areas would often use various headscarves or straw or fiber hats in order to do so. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European armies, and those influenced by them, mostly used two kinds of headgear in tropical climates: the pith helmet, which I have talked about before, and some form of felt slouch hat. The pith helmet was mostly favored by European armies in their colonies, and it did have the advantage of offering good sun protection to the head while ensuring air circulation and keeping it cool. In countries such as the United States, Australia, or South Africa, slouch hats were preferred. Slouch hats, wide-brimmed soft hats whose name comes from the brim's tendency to droop, were popular because they were easy to procure, very customizable, and rather hardy. The United States shaped theirs into the famous lemon squeezer campaign hat, also popular in Canada, whereas Australians pinned up a side to form their iconic hat. These two forms of headgear were quite effective for their purpose, keeping the sun off the head while not being too warm or heavy, but they had a major drawback that came to light once combat helmets became standard. They were rather cumbersome when not worn. As I have discussed in my video on the helmets of World War I, in the aftermath of that conflict, steel combat helmets became standard to wear in fighting zones, regardless of the climate. However, they were heavy and hot, and soldiers would want other kinds of headgear for when the helmet was not necessary. The trouble with slouch hats and pith helmets, which did continue to be used in between the world wars, is that there were few good options for storing them when not in use that did not either take up space or risk damaging them beyond usefulness. Countries therefore started looking for alternatives. In the 1920s, the British Army experimented with a form of the full-brimmed deerstalker hat, though this was eventually rejected. In the US, in 1937, a blue denim fatigue uniform was issued for certain work details that included a soft, wide-brimmed hat that was nicknamed the Daisy May hat, after the character in the comic strip Lil Abner. This hat was very similar to the modern Boonie, mostly differing with the dome-shaped crown. It was later issued in 1941 in olive drab color with the Army's hot weather twill uniform. Also in the late 1930s, the Soviets started issuing a hat to troops in sunny Central Asian postings that eventually became known as the Panamka, due to its supposed resemblance to a Panama hat. The British and Commonwealth forces then came up with their own lightweight canvas hat for use in tropical climates, called the bush hat. These various types of hats saw service in the hot battlefields of the Pacific and North Africa during World War II. However, they were at that point still seen mostly as a rear lines item for chore duty, with soldiers, when not wearing their helmets, usually improvising other covers in the field. The fighting in Southeast Asia by American and Australian troops did, however, show that the old campaign and slouch hats, which were worn punctually by the former and more widely by the latter, with their felt constructions, were not fully adapted to modern tropical warfare. After the Second World War, several conflicts relating to decolonization brought about further developments in tropical headgear. British and Australian troops deployed to Malaysia during the Malayan Emergency, which saw communist forces try to evict the British from the region, widely adopted a form of the bush hat closely resembling a civilian bucket hat, due to its more lightweight, comfortable construction than the felt slouch hat. At that time, it acquired the nickname Giggle Hat amongst Australians, as it was said that its floppy appearance looked mildly ridiculous and would elicit giggles from soldiers. Variations of this hat quickly became popular with Commonwealth forces throughout the warm weather postings. Meanwhile, the French came up with the Chapeau de Brousse Modèle 1949, or Model 1949 bush hat. Larger and stiffer than its British or American counterparts, it was made of canvas stiffened with rows of stitching and with snaps to allow the brim to be pinned up on one side or the other, much like the Australian slouch hat. This hat saw use in Indochina in the 1950s and in Algeria in the early 60s. But it was in the jungles of Vietnam that the most widespread Boonie hat today gained popularity. When US forces arrived in Vietnam in the 1960s, they did not have any particular jungle hat. When not wearing a helmet, soldiers were officially to wear a sort of baseball cap derivative. The first to use what would be considered a Boonie hat were special forces, who had them made by local tailors, and these usually took the shape of the French modèle 1949. These forces liked them, beyond their comfort in these tropical climates, because the floppy brim would break up the shape of the head in foliage and help camouflage. Very quickly, military authorities took notice. Taking inspiration from the British and Australians and their bush and giggle hats, which were worn by these troops at all times when outdoors and not wearing a helmet, they soon developed a new kind of hat with a flat-topped, soft crown with vents and loops in the band to allow for foliage to be inserted in order to help camouflage. In 1967, this hat jungle with insect net, as the Army with its ever-poetic official designations named it, began to be issued to the troops, and very quickly caught on, soon gaining the nickname Boonie hat. So I should pause to examine where the term Boonie hat comes from. Boonie is an abbreviation of boondocks, a term now often used to refer to a backward or isolated area, sometimes rural, disconnected from urban sophistication. The term comes from the Tagalog word boondock, meaning mountain, and was adopted by American soldiers during the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century. In military slang, it came to mean a somewhat confusing backwater location, and so when encountered in the jungles of Vietnam, the hat worn in the boonies became the Boonie hat. As the US increased its presence in the jungles of Vietnam, and soldiers spent more time outside in the field rather than in garrisons, the hat became increasingly worn and popular. It, like its Australian counterpart, had the advantage of being able to be either folded in a pocket when the helmet was needed, or even worn underneath it if necessary. The wide brim protected from the sun, and shielded to some extent from the rain. One drawback is that it would sometimes tend to droop down in the front when wet, leading some soldiers to cut the brim down a little, though this practice was officially discouraged. Others would use the chin strap to fold the brim up on the sides to give it some rigidity. Another practice was to sew an orange lining to the inside of the hat, allowing it to be reversed and mark out friendly positions for helicopters. While the war did not in the end go America's way, the success and popularity of this hat ensured that it remained part of Army uniform inventory in future warm weather conflicts, simply with the camouflage pattern updated to match the rest of the uniform. Another tropical hat that I touched upon a bit ago that had a marked appearance in the 1980s was the Soviet Panamka. While developed in the 1930s, it came to greatest prominence during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where it was widely seen on coverage of the conflict. It differed from the bush, boonie, or giggle hat, with its dome-shaped construction more akin to the US Daisy May of World War II. It also featured a peculiar chin strap along the front, similar to that of dress caps. While it could technically be threaded through the holes in the brim to go under the chin, it was usually too short to fit comfortably, and so ended up being more decorative than anything else. The hat faded from use after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Boonie hat is still very much in use to this day, having spread in some form to many countries. The hat, sun, hot weather is still a very important piece of equipment of the US Armed Forces, particularly as several of the recent conflicts it has taken part in have occurred in places with very sunny climates, such as Iraq or Afghanistan. Several allies of the United States also use hats with a very similar, if not identical, design, simply made out of cloth with their own camouflage pattern, such as Germany, Canada, Japan, or Mexico. Similar ones are also used throughout Latin America, as the climates in these countries render the hat particularly adapted to the conditions there. The British bush hat and the Australian giggle hat, arguably the original versions with their shorter and sharper brim, are still widely used in their own countries and in other Commonwealth nations that Britain influenced, such as South Africa or New Zealand. Some countries, including the United States or South Korea, will have the wearers sew a tab with their rank onto the hat. Others, like China or Russia, will have their force insignia instead. Certain countries, like France or Russia, will also include a flap to protect the back of the neck in particularly sunny conditions. As it is quite an adaptable hat, while the basic design remains the same, it can often be customized depending on the issuing country's preference. Beyond the military, the Boonie hat has also gained popularity among civilians for outdoor activities such as hiking, hunting, or fishing, for the same reason it is used by the military. It is cheap, practical, and adaptable. It can be found in various non-military colors, even sold by major sporting brands. A practical piece of gear, the Boonie hat evolved from the necessities of modern warfare in tropical environments. From the British and Australians, to the French, to the Americans, many countries have contributed to its development, and despite its sometimes slightly incongruous appearance, it is a useful and well-appreciated item for soldiers and civilians in hot, sunny environments. I hope once again you found this video interesting and will join me again soon for another hat. Until then, I tip my hat to you.